there was definitely this idea at the time that the map was something fluid and that borders were something that changed and that countries would come into existence or be destroyed. I mean, this was the area of the war in Yugoslavia, of the breakup of the Soviet Union. Angela Merkel grew up in a country, East Germany, that no longer exists anymore. For most of modern history, it's been the kind of norm that countries are created and destroyed and land is transferred between them. But we live in an era now when that doesn't really happen anymore. In the 21st century, there are only three newly created countries that have become members of the United Nations. There's Montenegro, East Timor, and South Sudan. And other than that, the world map has stayed relatively static. And it's been that way for most of the time that I've been covering international politics as a journalist. And I got to kind of thinking about these questions around 2008, when Kosovo became independent over the strong objections of Serbia and its ally Russia. And then when there was the 2008 Russia-Georgia war, when Russia kind of responded to that by recognizing these breakaway regions of Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And these are all countries that are sort of recognized by some countries, but not by others. They're semi-recognized places that are kind of on the margins of international politics. And places like that kind of became an obsession of mine and a topic I really wanted to follow. And the sort of interest in borders and sovereignty questions seemed like sort of a marginal interest of mine until about 2014, when all of a sudden stories about sovereignty and borders were everywhere. This was when Russia annexed Crimea. This is when we saw the emergence of the Islamic State, of ISIS, which sort of part of its whole mission, if you want to call it, was to erase the borders of the Middle East, to break through the border, in this case between Syria and Iraq, and establish a new caliphate under its own sort of brand of Islamic law. And at the same time, we saw China building artificial islands in the South China Sea to extend its territorial claims in that part of the world. So all of a sudden, borders were kind of hot again, and it seemed like a time when it was sort of an interesting time to take up these questions. And that's kind of the background of why I decided to write a book, both about what defines a country in the modern world, who gets to decide what is or isn't a country, and why it's so hard to either create new ones or adjust the lines around the countries that do exist. And Haley, in her introduction, mentioned the places that I traveled to in the process of sort of reporting on these questions. And all that is kind of background to explain how it was that in the summer of 2016, I found myself in the breakaway Republic of Abkhazia reporting on a soccer tournament for unrecognized countries. So I'm going to, this is how I open the book, and I'm just going to read a few pages, and then we can move on to a discussion. It was close to dusk on the Black Sea coast when the parade of imaginary countries began. On the surface, it was an event not unlike the opening ceremonies of any other international sporting event. Sequin divas belted cheesy inspirational pop ballads, choreographed masses of dancers performed a tribute to the glorious history of the host nation. Athletes, most with little hope of making it past the early rounds of competition, mugged for selfies and proudly waved their flags. But the 12 teams that had made the journey to the World Football Cup in Abkhazia in June 2016 were representing countries that are not at all like the countries at the Olympics or the World Cup. And none of the flags paraded through the stadium that night are on display outside UN headquarters in New York City. These were countries that most people don't consider countries at all. The World Football Cup, organized by the Confederation of Independent Football Associations, or CONIFA, is where countries compete when they don't meet the threshold of statehood required for membership in bodies like FIFA, the International Olympic Committee, or for that matter, the UN General Assembly. Some were the type of places that are described in news reports by dismissive phrases like breakaway semi-autonomous, or self-proclaimed. The host country, Abkhazia, was one such, de facto independent since breaking off from newly independent Georgia in a devastating civil war that ended in 1993, but is today recognized only by Russia and 3 other countries. It's actually 4 now at the time I wrote the book. As far as the United States and Europe were concerned, this event was being held in Georgia. A team represented the Kurds, the largest ethnic group in the world without its own state, but one that is now tantalizingly close to achieving the dream of independence. Somaliland, the unlikely and unrecognized beacon of stability in the Horn of Africa, was also represented, as was Northern Cyprus, the Turkish-dominated northern half of the Mediterranean island. Some teams represented groups wronged by history. The Western Armenia contingent represented a Turkish-Armenian community decimated during World War I. The Chagos Islanders, originally from a small archipelago in the Indian Ocean, but now living largely in the Crawley area of London, were evicted from their home islands by the British government in 1971 so the United States could build a military base on Diego Garcia, an expulsion the islanders continue to challenge in domestic and international courts. Other teams represented ethnic minorities who found themselves on the wrong side of international borders, such as the Koreans of Japan or the Hungarians of Romania. A Punjabi team purported to represent not only the historical region today divided by between the countries of India and Pakistan, but the global Punjabi diaspora. A Sami team represented an indigenous group living in northern Scandinavia that has achieved a significant level of political autonomy in recent years. Rounding out the competition were some European regions, Padania, or northern Italy, and Rhaetia, the Romansh-speaking region of Switzerland, that seemed less interested in making a political statement than in just playing some football. This team is not like a political thing. I think Italy is fine the way it is, the Padania goalkeeper told me at the opening ceremony. At the opposite end of the intensity scale was Harpreet Singh, a 33-year-old London accountant who had quit his job and poured his life savings into building the Punjabi team. He told me, "I don't consider myself Indian. The Indians have perpetrated atrocities against Punjab. I don't consider myself British. I don't hate them, but I choose not to be associated with being British." After asking me to imagine how I would feel if my own family were murdered in front of me, he asked, "If you ask me now, what is your family? My family is all Punjabis worldwide. They're my family. They are more important to me than my own wife and children." Only the hardiest fans of esoteric international soccer made the long trip to Abkhazia to watch the tournament, but a fair number of foreign reporters were in attendance, attracted by the quirky spectacle of a World Cup for countries that don't exist. The event was also a blatant propaganda exercise for the host country, Abkhazia, a place that doesn't rate highly for news coverage, even compared to other participants in the frozen conflicts of the post-Soviet world. It was easy to be skeptical about the event, and Kunifa, the Isle of Man-based body staffed by a skeleton crew of volunteers, but I appreciated the open-minded approach to nationhood taken by the event. Kunifa currently has 47 members, and no, you can't just declare your local pub an independent nation and start a team. New members are decided on by a vote of the existing membership and generally have to be semi-autonomous states or minority groups recognized by international NGOs. Still, a few members, such as Cascadia, a region of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, seemed a little dubious to me. More than any other activity, except perhaps war, for which they often serve as a metaphor, sports can bring the world's countries into contact with each other. You don't have to buy the kumbaya platitudes of organizations like FIFA and the IOC to acknowledge that the appreciation of athletic competition, particularly the world's most popular sport, has a rare ability to cut across national boundaries, even as it incites national pride. Because a national team is often seen as the proxy for a country's ambitions on the world stage, events like the World Cup and the Olympics serve to reinforce an international community's narrow definition of national legitimacy. Only real countries need apply. Whatever your views on the current borders of the Caucasus, Central Europe, or the Middle East, Kunifa's open-minded approach is refreshing, an acknowledgement that most countries start out as a dream before they become widely acknowledged reality. Nations have been referred to as imagined communities for good reason. What countries aren't self-proclaimed, after all? There's also something undeniably poignant in the alternate history of the world that the event displayed. If a few battles, peace conferences, and revolutions had turned out differently, it's not at all hard to imagine an alternate historical timeline in which Punjab, Padania, and Kurdistan are established countries with seats at the United Nations and teams in the Olympics, while Pakistan, Italy, and Iraq are merely the fanciful notions of dreamers and fanatics. The event was a useful reminder that the map of the world we all know today is the product of a series of accidents and historical processes that could just as easily have gone another way. And so that's how I start out, and I guess we'll continue with some questions from Haley.
Thank you, Josh. So in reading the book, I certainly learned a lot, but during your research, what did you find most surprising about these invisible countries and I guess the concept of nationhood?
Yeah, well, I think what I started, well, one thing is that every time you visit one of these countries, people talk as if the case for their independence is self-evident, that there's all this, centuries of history that prove why we should be independent, why our case for statehood is so much stronger than the conflicting cases of either the country that we're recognized as a part of or some rival. And so that's universal, but the kind of criteria on which people base nationhood is more varied, I think, than people realize. I mean, there are places where the differences are premised on religion, on language, and sort of one of the more fascinating cases I found was this place, Somaliland, I visited, which is internationally recognized just as the northern region of Somalia. And for all we talk about the colonial borders of Africa and how Europe drew these artificial lines through the ethnic realities on the ground, what Somaliland is actually proposing is to redraw the colonial boundaries. This was the part of Somalia that was a British colony, and the rest of it, that country was an Italian colony. And so their case for independence is based on the premise that we were always two separate countries. So that just kind of reinforced to me this sort of wide variety of criteria, including so-called arbitrary colonial boundaries that people can use to define their case for nationhood.
So not to be confused with microstates or the unrecognized states, you also talked a little bit about, in one of your outlier stories, about the micronation of Liberland.
Yeah.
And I know that in the book you mentioned that you'd applied for citizenship. I'm not sure if you've heard back from them yet. So I've thanks to various companies like Great Big Story, I've heard of things like the tongue-in-cheek micronation of the Republic of Molossia in Nevada, and I just was curious if you think there are any serious merits to these claims, these no man's land places, as you call them in the book.
Yeah, well, Liberland, by way of background, there's a unclaimed patch of land on the border between Serbia and Croatia. This is basically this one small patch that neither country wants. They both have claims on land further down the river, so they say, no, this is your territory. And so there's this guy, Jedlička, who's a sort of radical libertarian politician from the Czech Republic, and he had this notion, like he was sort of sick of trying to make his case for abolishing all taxes and in the Czech Republic, and he said, oh, why don't we just start a new country since this is terra nullius, it's unclaimed land. So he literally went there, planted a flag, and has proclaimed this the independent Republic of Liberland. And a lot of people have have applied for citizenship. My citizenship has not yet been granted, partly because I haven't yet made a donation, I think. But I guess what the reason I included the Liberland case, because it's such a weird outlier, is just to sort of reemphasize that almost every piece of land in the world, unless you're in Antarctica, is claimed by at least one country. Wherever you are, in the world. If you're on land, you're in one country or another. And if we're not going to allow border changes, then that means it's very hard to start new countries. And it's only these kind of like weird outlier cases. There's another one between Sudan and Egypt. This guy from Virginia went and claimed a few years ago. But and recently there's Asgardia, which is the first nation in space. So and there's a whole movement called seasteading. There's actually Milton Friedman's grandson has this institute where he's you want to build these kind of floating platforms that are going to sort of have their own charter laws. So you get on sort of that level of fringe when you talk about starting entirely new countries.
So when we think about invisible countries, it seems, at least to me, that most Americans think about places like Palestine or Taiwan, and that we forget that we have communities right here within our own borders who also claim sovereignty. And you go into issues with the town of, and correct me if I'm pronouncing this wrong, but Akwesasne,
Yeah.
Such as dealing with 8 different governments who have some form of jurisdiction, since it borders both the U.S. and Canada, and that it's less than 40 square miles with 8 different governments kind of within this town. Can you talk to us a little about these complexities and how many Native Americans are working to reverse decades of termination policies and by reestablishing their sovereignty through things like tribal governments?
Yeah, Akwesasne is a fascinating place. It's basically a kind of 2.5-hour drive north of Syracuse. It's divided between New York State, Quebec, and Ontario, and which means that all those governments have to some degree sovereignty, and because Canada and the U.S. have sort of different legal systems for how they interact with Indigenous governments. That means there's a Canadian recognized government in Akwesasne, there's a U.S. recognized government, and there's a sort of traditional Mohawk government that's affiliated with the Iroquois League. So it is this sort of cartographical jurisdictional nightmare when you that makes it. And it affects people's daily lives. You have to drive through international borders, sometimes twice, to get from one part of town to another because of the way the river bends. And so, so it is this sort of strange place where when you're in the town, you don't actually know what countries you're in. Somebody pointed out to me that you can tell if you're in Canada and the US by the color of the fire hydrants. If the fire hydrants are red, that means you're in the US. If they're yellow, you're on the Canadian side. But there's no marker when you're crossing the border in Akwesasne. And actually, I got into some trouble when I crossed the border later into Canada, and they started quizzing me on like what parts of town I'd been to. And they were like, "Oh, do you go to the tribal council in St. Regis?" I was like, "Oh yeah, I had a meeting there." They were like, "You crossed illegally into Canada earlier today. You should not have done that." So it's a place where the border both doesn't exist in a lot of ways, but it's also this kind of constant presence in the lives of people who live there. And so I wanted to explore sort of that as a sort of weird, anomalous case. But also, I think one of the underreported stories is the kind of reassertion of Native sovereignty within the U.S. and the degree to which Indigenous nations within the U.S. and sort of differently in Canada have reasserted their political sovereignty, and I think that's something that sort of doesn't get a lot of coverage. It did to a certain extent during the Standing Rock protests in 2016, and some of these recent lawsuits involving fracking in Oklahoma. But it is, I think, a undercovered story. Whereas, not discounting the social and economic problems that a lot of these sort of independent nations within the U.S. face, but it is a sort of remarkable story that kind of nation building on a kind of local level that's happened in the U.S. And sort of beyond that issue, I mean, now particularly in the wake of Hurricane Maria, there's been a kind of sort of renewed emphasis on the questions of Puerto Rico's status within the U.S. and how sort of U.S. territories, their status within the U.S. Constitution. So I think you're right. I think that those of us who write about international politics tend to think of sovereignty issues and border disputes as something that happens just in the Middle East or in the Caucasus or in Africa, when there are sort of examples we can point to of that closer to home as well.
You mentioned Puerto Rico, and in your book you talk about one of the stateless people that you interviewed who had lived here and loved to travel, and oftentimes did that through visiting places that were like American territories, like Puerto Rico or American Samoa, but that at the time he had self-deported and by visiting the country of Samoa as well.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. This guy, Michael Sebastian, who I interviewed for the book, who is a stateless person, which is a difficult thing to be in a world where your civil and political rights are usually tied to the country that has its name on the cover of your passport. Mikhail is ethnic Armenian, was born, I believe, in Azerbaijan, grew up mostly in Uzbekistan. The last country he was a citizen of was the Soviet Union. He's also gay, which means that living in Uzbekistan was not really tenable for him if he was going to be out. And so he came to the U.S. The U.S. is a signatory to the Convention on Statelessness, which means if you are a stateless person, you can't be deported. But he was also in this sort of limbo status where he couldn't travel outside the country because that would be considered self-deportation. So most people in his circumstance, they would kind of lay low and not sort of challenge this. But Mikhail really loves to travel, and so the way he would get around this was by traveling to U.S. overseas territories. So he'd go to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands and to Guam and to Samoa. And I think what he didn't realize, American Samoa has kind of a different status than the rest of the U.S. overseas territories for various complicated reasons, dealing with U.S. early 20th century colonialism and some court decisions. But American Samoans, for instance, don't have birthright citizenship the way that Puerto Ricans do, for instance. And he also, unknowingly on this trip, traveled to the country of Samoa, which is an independent country. And so basically when he tried to get back into the US, he was told he had self-deported and he was not going to be allowed in. And he was stuck there for months, basically staying in someone's house and using the Wi-Fi at a McDonald's to try and raise attention for his case and talk to lawyers. And eventually, after he was interviewed on CNN and NPR, he was let back into the U.S. And now he has a green card. And, but he travels pretty constantly. He works in the coffee import business, and this is an issue. Like every time he crosses a border, he gets taken, for secondary questioning because people are like, "What is your nationality?" He says, "I don't have one." His case is a kind of fascinating, anomalous one, but this is a growing problem. And there's a whole generation of Syrian refugees being born in places like Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon who are not citizens of those countries. And it's going to be a crisis in the coming years when those people don't have a government that is responsible for providing them rights. I mean, the first thing that, from Nazi Germany up till the Rohingya crisis today, the sort of step one of before an ethnic massacre is to deny people citizenship and to sort of denationalize them and claim that they're foreigners within the country, often where they were born. So that Mikhail's is kind of I mean, it's a difficult story for him, but it's really a kind of I think an unrecognized crisis in a world where we sort of take for granted that just as every piece of territory in the world has to be part of one country, we sort of assume that every person has to be a citizen of at least one country.
One of the things that I found most interesting about the book was the chapter on stateless peoples, and it seems that when we discuss invisible countries, we also have to consider the plight of these stateless peoples, as you said. What are your thoughts now today, even here in the United States, on the issues coming up with people at the border of the United States having their citizenship questioned and passports revoked and that type of thing as well?
Yeah. I mean, I started the book, as I said, in 2016, and had no idea just how much in the air borders were going to be in the time since I wrote it. I think when I was writing the book, I had this idea that yes, while borders, when I started writing it, I had this idea that yes, borders were sort of to a great degree fixed and unchanging, but maybe that didn't matter so much. Maybe borders were becoming less relevant because people are traveling more, people are increasingly living outside the countries where they were born, and we have economic globalization and the internet, and so maybe it's just not going to matter so much that which side of a border you live on. And I think since particularly in the last few years, we've seen the rise both in this country and in Europe and in parts of South Asia, the sort of rise of these nationalist governments who are very much fixated on questions of sovereignty and protecting borders and strongly defining who belongs and who doesn't, and the sort of rights to cross into countries. And I think that I in my intro I talked a little bit about the Kosovo example and the kind of fears of this old kind of expansionist nationalism, the kind of nationalism that means we're going to conquer parts of the country next door because we think it's historically ours, or people who speak the same language or the same religion as us live there. And that's a real fear, but I think more so what we're seeing today is a kind of inward-looking nationalism where the emphasis is not so much on expansion, but on sort of building borders around ourselves and both keeping the outside world out and questioning who's allowed inside too. And I think that and to have and the U.S. is a kind of exceptional country in that birthright citizenship is a core principle here, and that we don't denationalize people. And I think that to see people's citizenship being questioned in that way, sometimes people who are born here or who have been citizens for years, is a kind of disturbing precedent and the kind of thing you don't expect to see in this country.
So you delve into 5 countries in particular in your book, and several others that you deem these outlier situations, but there are obviously many others. When you were writing, how did you decide on these 5 examples? And if you could have written about 1 or 2 others, which would you have chosen and why?
Sure. Well, some of them, I went Abkhazia. It was in part I went there because there was the soccer tournament that was such a perfect framing device for the book. But it is also I'd say each of the places of the book kind of frame an issue I want to talk about. Abkhazia is a place that sort of exemplifies how great power politics sort of defines who gets to be a country and who doesn't. This is a place that's sort of propped up by Russia. Abkhazia wouldn't exist as an independent country if it wasn't essentially militarily occupied by Russia. When you cross the border, or border if you're Georgian, from Georgia into Abkhazia, you are questioned by the FSB, the successor to the KGB, the Russian Interior Ministry. So that was an example of that. Somaliland, as I said, is a kind of like limbo case where it is essentially independent. It has its own armed forces, flag, currency, borders, government, everything that defines a country, but it's not recognized by a single other country. And so that's what I was looking at there. Akwesasne was an example of a kind of a pre-modern polity or a political unit that sort of branched off, that sort of managed to survive in the modern world. Kurdistan was very much in the news at the time when I was looking at it. It looked like a place that was kind of on the brink because Iraq's borders and governing institutions had collapsed in the face of the invasion by ISIS, and because Kurdistan looked so comparatively stable, it really seemed at the time that it was a place that was kind of the best candidate for becoming independent. And then Kiribati was a place I visited because not as a country that could come into existence, but as a country whose existence is threatened. It's a small island state, only a couple meters above sea level, even at its highest points, that is threatened by rising sea levels, and is kind of portends some of the very difficult and dark questions that we're going to have to face as climate change could make some existing national governments no longer tenable as independent political units. So those are kind of the issues I wanted to explore in all the places I did visit. I was hoping to visit Crimea, just as an example of, I've talked a lot about how borders don't change, and this is obviously the kind of textbook example of one that has. It's even if most of the countries in the world don't recognize Russian sovereignty over Crimea, and probably won't for the foreseeable future, it is also, for all intents and purposes, it's been conquered by Russia or annexed by Russia, and and nobody seems to be in a position to challenge that either. So that would have been a fascinating place to visit. I didn't, in most part, because it's very difficult to report there now. It's because of just the political situation there. It's very difficult to ask these kind of questions to people, and people are kind of reluctant to talk about them there. And it just didn't really seem to worth it to travel there if I couldn't do the kind of interviews I wanted. Another place that would have been interesting to visit would be Taiwan, just kind of the whenever you talk to people in unrecognized states, they point to Taiwan as kind of the gold standard. It's like a place that's widely unrecognized. It's recognized by a few countries, but it's it is obviously a wealthy country. It's democratic, has functioning institutions, but it and is now kind of facing a concerted Chinese pressure campaign to get both other state governments not to recognize it, and even companies. I mean, there's this campaign to get airlines to sort of remove any language from their websites or from their literature that implies that Taiwan is an independent country and not just a region of China. So Taiwan would have been an interesting place to look at. Obviously, the Palestine, the Palestinian territories is a place where these issues are maybe get the most international attention. It's kind of the one that's the best known border conflict, sovereignty conflict in the world today. Kind of steered clear of it, mostly because of that, because I think the issues are so well covered, and that most readers will probably come into them with some preconceptions. And I want some places that maybe would be a little newer to most of the people reading the book.
Questions from the audience?
So I've just started to read the book Revenge of Geography. I'm not very far into it, but I'm thinking that what this author is talking about is how where countries are located and even their physical topography have influenced how they came to be, whether or not they continue to exist or will continue to exist. So I'm wondering if you're familiar with that work, and if you are, is there any intersection between your work and that?
Well, I'm very grateful to Robert Kaplan for the blurb on the book. So, yeah, no, I am familiar with it. It does come up. I think particularly in the Kurdish case, it's extreme. I mean, someone I was talking to recently about this basically said new landlocked countries don't work. It's just impossible to start one. And I think that did kind of come up in their case that, despite having well-defended borders and the sort of bi-regional standards, a pretty powerful military and sort of trade links with the outside, we saw after they held their referendum in 2016, it was extremely easy for all the surrounding countries, for Iraq, Iran, and Turkey to blockade them, basically, and could put enormous pressure on them. And I think that their geographical location has been a major obstacle to their long-running quest for independence. So yeah, I that certainly is a factor, and Somaliland, its project is there's a lot of investment from the UAE, from Dubai, to sort of build a port in Berbera, which is a sort of coastal city in Somaliland, and that could be like an alternative shipping route into East Africa, into East Ethiopia. And so, absolutely, these factors come into play. I mean, I think in terms of the revenge of geography, I think geography sort of plays out in international conflicts in a different way than it did in previous eras. I mean, President Trump likes to talk. He's sort of fixated on this idea of Iran building a link to the Mediterranean. Somebody clearly said this to him at one point, and he's like brought it up in several speeches. And that doesn't mean it is a real issue, but that doesn't mean that Iran is literally going to sort of conquer territory, from to the shores of the Mediterranean. But it's sort of building these relationships of sort of dependent Shia-dominated governments between themselves, and so I think that part of the idea of the book is that the actual shape of the countries, the borders that we have, aren't as much a factor in geopolitical competition. But that doesn't mean that these sort of geographical factors that Kaplan talks about in much greater detail than I do don't play a role.
Sir?
I remember going to a lecture several years ago, and they were talking, the premise of the speech was that the way the borders were drawn in the Middle East at the end of World War II basically set us up for all these conflicts. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, well, World War II is one factor. I mean, I think that what people often refer to as the Sykes-Picot Borders, which refers to a agreement between the British and French drawn after World War I that did sort of define the spheres of influence for that time between Britain and France, and Russia played a role in it as well. I think it's a bit of a misnomer. It's Sykes-Picot is a little overrated in that the actual line that was drawn in that treaty doesn't quite match up with the current boundaries, and a lot of the borders between Iraq and Syria, for instance, actually go back to sort of internal Ottoman Empire boundaries. And so, but all that being said, I think that there clearly colonialism played a major role in defining the map of the Middle East as we see it today. The country of Jordan, for instance, there's that. The nickname for it is Winston's hiccup. The idea that Winston Churchill was one day just drew a straight line through the in drawing the eastern boundary of Jordan. That's true in Africa as well. I think that sometimes when we talk about artificial boundaries, that sort of implies that some of them are natural, and that you could if you look at sort of countries like Hungary, for instance, which is or Poland or Romania, or these countries in Central Europe that are very ethnically homogenous today, and that sort of come up in their reluctance to take in large refugees populations. They say, we don't have a history of having heterodox populations. This is a unitary Hungarian state. It's like, well, how do you think it got that way? Like, there used to be large Jewish populations. There used to be large ethnic German populations, Romanian populations, and then it took basically centuries of border conflicts and ethnic cleansing for these so-called natural borders to be drawn. But I think a lot of I talk a lot in the book about Woodrow Wilson's 14 points and what was his big idea after World War I was this notion that rather than great power politics and empires and borders being traded between in boardrooms, that the sort of boundaries of Europe and the Middle East should conform to nations, by which he meant ethnic groups, basically, to peoples. The problem quickly became evident even in 1919, and it continues to be an issue 100 years later, is that one, nobody can define what a people is, and two, peoples don't separate themselves neatly. Wherever you draw a line between Hungarians, Romanians, between Jews and Palestinians, between Sunnis and Shia, there are going to be people on the wrong side of it, and often a border adjustment can be just sort of prelude to more conflict. There are not that many peaceful partitions in world history. I mean, Czechoslovakia is the exception to the rule. Things like Yugoslavia, like the partition of India, are a lot more common. So, that's why I get skeptical when I hear people say, like, oh, these are just artificial boundaries. What we should do is, divide Iraq in three, and that would solve all the problems. Or if we should just draw, split up Syria, that would solve it. I mean, I think that's wishful thinking.
Yes.
You mentioned the redrawing of the boundaries between the Crimean Peninsula as a result of the Russian annexation as being an example of a time when the maps were essentially changed in recent history. And I'm wondering about your thoughts about the Brexit situation, where perhaps it's not a redrawing of national maps, but rather a redrawing of supranational maps, and kind of the associated idiosyncrasies of whether or not, for example, financial firms will be able to operate under a UK regime or a European regime under passporting, and essentially whether you think that supranational boundary changes will end up being perhaps not equally, but maybe more important than they currently are.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I was alluding to before a little bit when I said I had this idea that maybe even if borders are staying, my old idea that even if borders are staying the same, that they're becoming less relevant because, look at the European Union. You can move freely between these France and Germany, countries with centuries of conflict. And Brexit is, I think, a pretty strong counterexample to that, an idea that there is a backlash to that notion that because of a lot of factors that are probably best left for another discussion. There is this kind of backlash to economic globalization and to immigration that has people sort of clinging to old ideas of sovereignty, to Little Englandism, and we need to protect our nation. One of the things that's fascinated me most about Brexit is looking at the implications of it for Ireland. That there's a generation now that has grown up with sort of free transit of people, goods, and services between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And one of the main sort of stumbling blocks in the negotiations between the UK and the European Union is this question of how Northern Ireland, as part of the UK, can be sort of separated from the EU economically, and how they can sort of continue to maintain border controls, control who enters the UK, while still having sort of an open border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And it's been sort of one of the big difficulties they have is how they thread that needle. And I think it's going to be, they've kind of punted it down the road for the time being, but it's going to be interesting to see how they resolve that. And I spent some time in both in the Republic of Ireland and in Belfast, and the kind of reminders of the troubles of that conflict are very evident. But I think that the European Union's sort of role in the end of those hostilities, in the end of that violence, shouldn't be downplayed, because I think that it kind of allowed the Northern Irish to have their cake and eat it too. That it could be have national sovereignty within the UK, as well as kind of all this free association with the Republic of Ireland. And I think that a lot of those issues were kind of downplayed for years because borders didn't matter so much. And one thing I worry about is what sort of separation of Britain from the EU will mean for them.
Other questions? Yes, in the back.
Do you think China is certainly expansionist in some ways? Do you think it's going to try and expand its borders more than it's already has, such as in Siberia, pushing into India?
Well, there's an ongoing border conflict with India, particularly it's actually with Bhutan, but sort of Indian area. It is funny with China, because they when you talk to Chinese officials, they tell you all about their peaceful rise and how, like, unlike other previous great powers, they don't have any military conflicts with their neighbors. But then they've had sort of a territorial conflict with every single one of their neighbors, if you look at it. China has an interesting role in this. I mean, China tends to be very hostile to separatism on a national scale for obvious reasons, because of Tibet and because of Xinjiang. And I think it's like shameful how little attention the situation that the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, and what's basically a cultural genocide that the Chinese government is carrying out there. I think that the lack of attention that's gotten both from the U.S. government and from other Islamic countries has been really embarrassing. But going beyond that, so they have this kind of hostility to separatism. Then they have these sort of quasi-sovereign entities in Hong Kong and Macau. They've sort of been working to reassert their political sovereignty over, and Taiwan, obviously, as I mentioned before, is sort of ongoing conflict. And then there's this kind of push to establish sovereignty over the South China Sea through the building of these artificial islands, which is kind of the avant-garde of sovereignty disputes, is actually like building new land in the ocean. So yeah, I mean, I think China's going to be a major factor in what the map of the world looks like in the coming century, and I think it's and also you see it's not so much in terms of sort of direct territorial conflict, but they've been sort of there are all these countries where Chinese state-affiliated investment has come in and sort of built ports and agricultural projects, and then in Sri Lanka recently they've sort of gone into debt to these Chinese state firms, and so sort of what that's going to mean going forward is a major question. So I think for all that China talks about its peaceful rise and how it's not interested in territorial conquest, I think that they are sort of more active in these disputes than they might let on.
We have time for one more. Yes, sir.
You talked earlier about, I think it was Somaliland that had, ticked off all the checkpoints for nationhood, but not even rogue governments nowhere have recognized them. Why is that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and one they talk about a lot. They have sort of a informal, there's a consulate of Ethiopia there, and they're sort of increasing investment in from the Gulf states, as I mentioned. I mean, one is it's I think the international community has sort of made it a major priority to keep or to sort of prevent the breakup of Somalia, to sort of build Somalia as a viable state, and I think in the African Union particularly, there's a real resistance to border adjustments and to separatism, because every single African country, the borders of which are usually the product of colonialism, and every single one of those places has a minority group that would like to be independent. I mean, I think there's a real fear that if Somaliland gets to do this, then why not Biafra next? There's a conflict for Anglophone. There's an Anglophone minority in Cameroon that wants sovereignty. Kenya has this in Mombasa, and so I think that there's a real kind of regional reluctance to recognize new territorial claims, and they do it very reluctantly. South Sudan and Eritrea being the kind of exceptions, and South Sudan, frankly, has not been a good precedent for countries like Somaliland, because I think that was a place that has sort of proven that independence does not solve your problems. If you don't start out with functioning state institutions, they're not going to suddenly emerge just because you have a placard at the United Nations and a flag. And so I think that just to circle back to how I started to wrap things up. I think that if you go back to that Merkel quote, and I think you see this attitude in Africa as well, that there's a real reluctance. If you look at the countries of the world as a kind of club, there's a real reluctance to admit new members or kind of open the door to territorial adjustments. And frankly, there are very good reasons for that. I mean, we came out of a very dark century of conflict, largely fought over territory, and for all the all the military conflicts and crises we face in the world today, one thing that actually doesn't happen, one kind of positive development you can look at, is that it's pretty rare these days for two countries to go to war over territory. It's something that, Crimea accepted, almost never happens now. And it's not coincidental that, that is coincides with a time when, as I mentioned, we have this sort of period of stasis, when the world map has stayed relatively the same. And the question of whether that's a historical anomaly, whether this is just a short period of stasis that we'll look back on as an exception, or whether it portends some sort of larger end of history scenario and we're sort of moving towards a kind of a different model of how things work, that I couldn't tell you. That's, I guess, the subject of the next book.
Thank you. We will have Josh's book available for sale, and he's agreed to stick around to sign copies. Thank you again. Thanks, Josh.